Okay, I want to welcome everybody to the show. Tonight's another off the cuff podcast. I want to do this one to just disambiguate some of the points that I've been making. Over the last couple of weeks, I've gotten some feedback. I want to go through some of that feedback tonight, just do some disambiguation. But I really want to ask the deeper question. Is theology, or I should say, is eschatology in particular, is it preteristic or is it presentistic? So I've kind of coined a name, and I know that it's been used in philosophy before. It's called Presentism. It's kind of just a name that I'm using as a placeholder to describe the eschatology that teaches that Christ's Parousia is happening now. It's a present reality. The resurrection is a present reality. The great white throne is a present reality. Now, make no mistake about it. These things were I should say consummated, but they began in the first century. So AD 70 is very, very important. But we're not waiting for a future second coming. We're not waiting for a future resurrection of dead bodies from the tombs. Now, I've studied a lot of preterist literature, and I think a lot of what they say is correct. It's right on the money. But I'm not what you would call a preterist, because I don't think that all of these things belong to the Mosaic economy and ended when the Mosaic economy ended in the first century. I think a lot of them belong to the Adamic realities. And so they continue, death and sin and all of the paraphernalia of the Adamic economy continue past AD 70. They're still being taken care of through the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. And ultimately, there will be a restitution of all things. So all men will ultimately re-enter the garden. That's the only thing that's going to solve the physical death problem. It's not the resurrection. The resurrection doesn't have anything to do with physical death. Because we have to remember now that when Adam and Eve, when they ate of that fruit of the forbidden, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, the forbidden tree, that they died in the same day. So they morally died. It was a moral death. Make no mistake about it. Now, it did have some, I think, anthropological side effects in that man is alienated from God, and it's sort of inwrought into his constitution that he should experience both good and evil. This becomes a process of human life, that we have a mixture of good and evil. It's because we chose a mixture of good and evil. And the message of Genesis is basically, okay, I'm going to clothe you in new skins. I'm going to give you a sacrifice. And now your business outside the garden is to cultivate nothing but the good. And this is why we have the line of the chosen seed, so to speak, coming in through Abel. And then, of course, Abel is killed by the seed of the serpent. And then you have the chosen seed, the line being carried on through Seth. Then, of course, you have Noah, you have Abraham. It goes on and on. But this is the message of Genesis: is if you choose the good, if you accept this sacrifice, this substitutionary sacrifice of Christ, which I take points back to Genesis 3:21, and only choose the good, ultimately you will re-enter the garden. Now, there's a division between humanity. There's the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. So this division is a process. It's a byproduct of Adamic sin, of the first transgression of Adam. So it needs to be taken care of. That's one of the reasons for the atonement, is to eradicate this sin problem. So ultimately, all humanity will re-enter the garden. But it's the death in the garden is moral in nature. It was a moral death that man died the day that he ate the forbidden fruit. He hid from God, so he was alienated from God. He tried to cover himself by his own works. And this was something that, of course, points back to the law. It points back to how Jehovah found man in the garden, in his garden, in the first century, what they were doing, how they were alienated from God. Not only that, but how they tried to cover themselves with the works of the ceremonial law. And then, of course, he pronounces a sentence upon them because they chose the law over Christ, the tree of life. He pronounces the sentence of being cursed and the sentence of eviction, but the ultimate the ultimate promise of reconciliation. So you have that going on as well. Now, I did write something here. Chris is weighing in. Let's see. So he says, why did Jesus die physically? Well, Jesus died physically. I did handle this in another podcast. It's the one called Jesus, the cross didn't pay for your personal sins or something to that effect. And the whole thing, the whole point of the cross was to stand in Adam's place and yield the obedience that he didn't yield, and then to suffer the penalty that he didn't deserve to suffer, so that he could overcome death in the grave, and so that he can get all men into the age to come. So if there was no cross, if there was no death and resurrection of Christ, there would be no afterlife. There would be no consciousness after death. It would be basically a Solomonic view of, as elaborated in Ecclesiastes, of all men, the grave being the final end. The grave, there's no knowledge in the grave whither thou goest. This is why in my last podcast, I talked about how resurrection starts with post-mortem conscious life, and then it is completed with somatic life, because somatic life, being given a new spiritual body, that completes the process of moral renewal, which begins, of course, when we're born again, but it completes that process. And so all humanity needs to be born again in the sense of being physically resurrected. But this physical resurrection is being given a new body that's conforms to the image of Christ. Do we deserve this? Absolutely, positively not. But those who follow Jesus Christ and those who attain that benchmark are going to get to the first resurrection, and those who don't, of course, they're get thrown into the second death. But the second death isn't forever. And so I wrote a short article about the dry bones being, I believe, and I take the unusual position that this prophecy of the dry bones in Ezekiel chapter 37 is talking about the resurrection of the wicked dead from Gehenna. The valley is the valley of Gehenna. It's talking about the wicked dead who had died the second death. Israel was given over to the second death in AD 70, and this is their resurrection from the second death. So it has a national or historic component, and it also has an individual component, as most eschatology does. There's a historic element, like if you look at the destruction of the temple in AD 70, that was the historic element behind the Parousia, which is very much it's also a historic element, but it has this recurring individualistic aspect where we all have to stand before the judgment seat. So I've made quite a bit of Leo Tolstoy's book, The Kingdom of God is Within You, because what Leo Tolstoy did, when he was not an Orthodox Christian by any stretch of the imagination, but what Leo Tolstoy did was he wrote a manifesto, as it were, against modern Christianity and how it sticks to this social pagan concept of life. So in Tolstoy's worldview, there's three views of human life. You've got the individualistic viewpoint, which is basically the most primitive kind of way of looking at the world, which basically focuses on the good of the individual, me and mine. And then you have the pagan/social concept of life, which has been held for hundreds and probably thousands of years. And it's all built upon where it's based upon man sacrificing his individual proclivities to the greater good of the group. And this is where you see Israel playing into this. Well, Jesus Christ comes along and he gives us the divine view of life. And the reason why most people can't accept Jesus Christ's teachings, even Christians can't accept his teachings, because they're still welded to this pagan social view of life. So I wrote this morning, let me see if I can blow this up. Let's see. I should be able to enlarge this. Okay, good. So what I wrote this morning was, Christ's teachings provide a cosmic Torah for all of Adam's descendants. Unlike the written Torah, which was strictly for national Israel, the cosmic Torah advances the human psyche from the pagan social concept of life to the divine concept. And of course, I said read Tolstoy. It is the inability to move beyond this pagan social worldview that causes most men to reject the Torah. And so it's an excellent book. I'm not going to dwell on it for too much longer, but it's a good book. You can find it. I've got a paperback copy here. It's translated by Constance Garnett. But anyways, it's a great book. Read it. But that doesn't have a lot to do. It's only tangentially related to the question of whether these things, these realities of the parousia, the resurrection, the great white throne are past or are they present. So that's why I've always recommended Samuel Lee's book on eschatology. I got it from Amazon. I've got a first edition back there, but it's also available on Gary DeMar's bookstore, Samuel Lee's Eschatology. And his position was that the coming of the Son of Man took place in AD 70. That was the setting up of Jesus Christ's evangelical government over the world. So it was the setting up of the kingdom of heaven over all nations. And then the coming of the Lord takes place at death. So you have this kingdom being set up in the first century, and then you have the administration of the kingdom being carried out, not only in this physical world, but also in the unseen world. Remember, Jesus Christ is the judge of the quick and the dead. And so he's governing the kingdoms right now. He's doing it in a moral sense. In other words, this is a moral government. It's the same kind of government that God gave to Adam when he said, okay, this is what you're going to do. You can eat of any tree in the garden, but don't touch this tree. So don't experiment with the knowledge of good and evil. Only choose the good. Now, he told us what this good was in the Sermon on the Mount and in his teachings. Basically, he narrowed it down to two precepts: love the Lord with all thy heart and thy neighbor as thyself. But this is how he administers his moral government. Now we could get into questions of is he rewarding and punishing now? Absolutely, but we need to also understand the factor of being judged after this probationary period is over. So are we talking about another historic epic that's coming up, or are we talking about an individual judgment that takes place at death? And I just want to make sure quickly. Okay, good. I wanted to make sure I was live. So those are some good issues to talk about. And I said yesterday, I said, no need to look for Parousia, second coming in our future. Christ said it would happen before his contemporary generation passed away. So that's what Christ said in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. He said that all these things will take place. He said, but verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. So he's talking about everything. He's talking about the whole shebang. He's talking about the great tribulation. He's talking about the parousia. He's talking about the resurrection. He's talking about the judgment. Then he said, of course, in the next verse, he said, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Now, that's a totally different podcast right there. It means his words still are in force today, meaning there's no, everything just goes away when AD 70 comes, and now we're left scratching our heads trying to figure out what the Christian faith is. The Christian faith is what Jesus Christ initiated in his ministry, and then what, of course, Paul and the other apostles completed during that 40-year wilderness period. Now this faith gets carried over into the land when the church enters the land in AD 70. But this is when the throne gets established. Remember, the throne gets established in the land. There was no throne in the wilderness. So this idea of, say, a full preterist idea of a 40-year millennium doesn't really match what we find in the scriptures. It's taking the kingdom of Christ and it's retrojecting it back into this 40-year period when they were still waiting for the kingdom. So the position that I take is that the millennium began in AD 70, and then it's still going on today. The millennium begins in AD 70. The Great White Throne also begins in AD 70. And the Great White Throne is where the dead, not the living, are judged. So when you die, you go before the Great White Throne. If you've made that benchmark that Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 3, being conformed to Christ, then you attain that first resurrection. If not, then you have to endure the second death. I don't believe that to be qualitatively a different form of death than, say, the first death. What it is it's separation, but separation and for the purposes of purification. And then after the 1,000 years are over, those dead, those who are given to the second death, they live again. So the rest of the dead live not until the 1,000 years are over. This is where you have your restitution of all things. So after the Gog and Magog battle, and there's all the corpses, and they have to go burn the weapons, and then they have 7 years. You see human history continuing. But then ultimately, you see some kind of restitution. So you have these passages sort of blocked together in Ezekiel. You have a vision of the return to the land. You have a vision of this horrible invasion of these foreign hordes. And this all has to be looked at typologically, of course. I mean, I'm not saying that it all has to be taken literally, but what it's teaching very, very important lessons as to what's going to take place after this millennial period is over, or in connection with the close of the millennial period. And then you have this vision in chapter 37 of the dry bones being resurrected and being brought back to the land. So this is going to be the resurrection of the wicked dead. And it could be meant the resurrection of the nation. It's going to have a nationalistic aspect as well. But I wrote about that in this post right here. And I said that the Gog and Magog war properly belongs at the close of the millennium, which started with the divorce of the Old Jerusalem and the marriage of the new in AD 70. I went on and I went on and I went on, and I talked about the dry bones being depicting the raising of Israel out of the second death valley of Gehenna, so that the cut branches may be grafted back in and all Israel be saved. Now, I understand there's some people that are going to say, well, that will all happen in AD 70. I think that's when the branches got cut off. I'm going to be perfectly frank with you on that one. I think that's when the branches got cut off. They were still on probation for that 40 years. The branches getting cut off are contemporaneous, or I should say synchronous, with the casting out of the wicked husbandmen out of the vineyard. And if you go back to, I believe it's Jeremiah chapter 11, talks about that olive tree being destroyed in connection, of course, with the upcoming invasion of Nebuchadnezzar and their first death. Their first national death when the first temple was destroyed. Well, now you have another national death, which is going to be the second death. This is when their second temple is destroyed, and this is when those branches get cut off. So I know Paul uses prolepsis quite a bit. For instance, in Ephesians, he talks about that middle wall of partition being cut down. And yes, positionally, if you will, as a legally, it was broken down at the cross, but effectually, experientially, it was actually taken away in AD 70 when Old Testament or Old Covenant Judaism was thrown in the bottomless pit. And that's when the millennium begins. So I take Satan to be Old Covenant Judaism, or actually I believe he's probably a spiritual entity, but he was incorporated into Old Covenant Judaism. He became identified with Old Covenant Judaism. And so when we talk about Satan being cast into the bottomless pit and then a seal being placed over him, we're talking about Old Covenant Judaism being chained so that it can no longer deceive the nations. And it can't. It hasn't been able to deceive the nations. Number one, because there's no temple, but number two, because every time they would try to deceive the nations would end up obviously either throwing them out or doing something that is not so kind. So they haven't really fooled anyone. And there's not a nation under heaven that accepts Judaism as its religion that I know of. Much less Old Covenant Judaism. Now I know the Israel and the Middle East. I know all of that. But remember that rabbinical Judaism was a workaround. It was a salvage job. It was not something that was being preached prior to the destruction of the temple. They really had to do a salvage to save Judaism. But that was something that I think a lot of people missed in their studies, especially those with whom I was in contact in their studies. When we would discuss these things, they would talk about the dry bones and all of this happened in the past. Well, according to Ezekiel, it seems to be taking place after this period of restoration when the nations have been restored. Those wastes were rebuilt. So this is taking place at a far distant time. And of course, Isaiah, he expressed, well, he gave a lot of prophecies concerning the millennial period, which would come in, I believe, in AD 70, once the bride was married. So that's going to be the new Jerusalem. That's not going to be the old Jerusalem, because we find in Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1, we find the unfaithful wife being put away. But then these millennial blessings begin. And he says, to restore the preservative Israel, I will also give thee a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation to the ends of the work. But he also talked about lifting his hand to the Gentiles, setting up his standard to the people. And there's another passage that I want to look at. Let's see. Said, they shall build up the ancient ruins, they shall raise up the former devastations, they shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. So he's talking about rebuilding civilization along Christian principles. That's what he's talking about. Building these ancient ruins, these cities, is rebuilding, because Judaism brought no health and healing to the world. It was nationalistic. It was very, stand away from me, I'm better than you, that sort of thing. It was very exclusivistic. Building up these ancient ruins, building up these devastations, these desolate cities, he's talking about rebuilding the world according to Christian principles. And so once this happens, once this period occurs, then this is when the Gog and Magog war take place. So this is right in accordance with what John says in Revelation 20. He's talking about Gog and Magog. Now, if you listen to any prophecy scholar, they'll tell you that Gog and Magog is right around the corner, can happen anytime. And well, that, according to some preterists, that can very possibly be. There may be a Gog and Magog war, but not because it's before the Great Tribulation and before all of the events, before the Parousia, but because it belongs where John said it belongs, at the end of the millennium. So, premillennialists would have to say, well, no, the Gog and Magog war begins during the tribulation, prior to the Parousia, but that's not what John says. So this is really the only view that I've found that can reconcile that placement, John's placement of the Gog and Magog battle. Then we have this vision of the dry bones, this raising of Israel out of the second death, so that the cut branches may be grafted back in and all Israel will be saved. Of course, two sticks will be joined together at the resurrection of every Israelite. So they're going to be joined in resurrection. So the same people that were cut off in the first century, the same branches that were cut off, what Paul's saying is the same branches, the same individuals who were cut off. So it doesn't matter if you put it past, if you put it in, AD 70, if you put it AD 50, whenever they were cut off, he says the same branches that were cut off are going to be grafted back in. He's very, very clear about that. And he says, I understand. He says God can graft them back in, but he says all Israel will be saved. So I had a gentleman, actually, I don't remember his name, but I was actually talking to him about this. And I'm going to get to that in just one moment, but I did want to say that in connection with this restoration of Israel, there's going to be other nations saved. He's talking about Sodom and her daughters returning to their former estate, Samaria and her daughters returning to their former estate, and you and your daughters returning to your former estate. Then, of course, establishing an everlasting covenant and giving the elder and the younger, giving Sodom and Samaria to Israel as daughters. So this is talking about the restitution of all things, which takes place after the wicked dead are restored. So after those who have suffered the second death, they've been in prison for 1,000 years, but they live again after the 1,000 years. So there's people dying, being judged all throughout this period. And those who make it to heaven are those who have the first resurrection. Those who don't meet that benchmark, they have to endure the second death. But then at the end of that period, you start to see things get restored. So you see the wicked dead being restored. You see, ultimately, I'm thinking after the Gog and Magog battle, this is when Sodom will be restored. This is when Samaria will be restored. So you have all these wicked dead being restored and being given back, being put back in their, apparently in their lands. That's something that I don't think any eschatology teaches, except the one that I teach, because I'm saying that the parousia happened in the first century, that it happened in AD 70. That's when it began. It continues all throughout the millennium, and it's a moral presence, it's a spiritual presence, and it's also a physical presence to those who have attained resurrection life. At the end of the 1,000 years, when everybody's restored, there will be a final manifestation of Christ. This is going to take place because mankind has been morally cleansed. Mankind has been, this moral rift between God and mankind, between Yahweh and the human race, is going to be, the breach is going to be closed. So something to think about. And I understand there's probably not going to be very many people that agree with this view, but it's something I think that is compelling enough to warrant a further investigation. And that's something that I've been doing for quite a few years. Now, I did want to say also that there's I.P. Warren's book, The Parousia, which is also, I think, very, very germane to where I'm going with this, because he does do a lot of exegetical work in the direction of proving that the parousia is not an event, a one-shot event, but it's also a dispensation. And let me see. If you have time, you can also check out Michael Rogers' book, In Millennialism, Redefining the Last Days. Now, Rogers, I've interviewed him on this channel. You can check that out. Rogers is a very good writer, and he's got a lot of great ideas, and he's very much influenced by I.P. Warren. Not so much Samuel Lee, but he's influenced by I.P. Warren, and he does take that view that the parousia is a dispensation. So I agree with him completely on that. Now, I don't remember where he places the Great White Throne. I'm going to have to read his book again. I'm pretty sure, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure he places it at the end of the millennium. I'm going to say that that's where he places it. But that would be something that I would disagree with. That's going to be something comparable to what, say, the post-millennialists teach, where there's this big great white throne judgment at the end of the millennium, and that's when the wicked dead are thrown into Gehenna, and that's the end of the story. They're not going to come back. I think putting that great white throne at the beginning of the millennium solves a lot of problems. That's what J. Stuart Russell did. That's what Thomas Whittemore and some of the great Universalist writers did. John Dodds in his books. All the Universalists, none of the Universalists have problems placing the Great White Throne where it appears to belong at the beginning of chapter 20, because they realize that if there's this age-abiding contempt, this age-during punishment, which Daniel talks about, which is going to, which many are going to suffer. Well, age-abiding, olam, doesn't mean forever. It means ultimately it's going to end. Well, John says the rest of the dead live at the end of the 1,000 years. So, I mean, this is not an eternal punishment. This is an Aeonian punishment. It lasts for the eons. And then, of course, I always like to talk about Matthew chapter 18, the parable of the debtor, the unforgiving debtor, how Christ cast him into prison so that he would pay until everything is paid. So that's to me, it's another way of saying the second death. It's another way of saying Gehenna. It's another way of saying outer darkness. But the goal of salvation is the restitution of all things. It's not, leaving things in their divided, fractured post-garden state, which is what would be really no salvation at all. It would be a confession of Christ's inability to save. Well, I could only take humanity up to this point where man got evicted from the garden, but I can't solve the problem between the two seeds. I can't bring everybody back into the garden. That's not how scripture talks of salvation. It talks of salvation. Number one is a universal salvation, but number two is an effectual salvation. It's an effectual salvation insofar as everyone will be redeemed. All things in heaven and in earth will be gathered under Christ. So there will be no more rebellion. There will be no more this fractured state of humanity. And that's basically how I take this. Now, I understand there's going to be people that disagree with me on this, but now this is something that I've looked into for many years. And so this is the only view that I know of that really works. I mean, I'm just going to be perfectly frank with you. This is the only view that I know of that actually answers all of the objections posed by, say, futurists and even by full preterists or partial preterists, post-millennialists, because everybody's got objections. And look, I've had my objections in the past. Why is Satan bound? If amillennialism is true, why is Satan bound? And we've got all of this deception going on in the world. Well, if you look at it from this perspective, the deceptions he's talking about was the deception that was going on during the Acts period, where they were running behind Paul and they were bad-mouthing him and they were pulling away the Gentiles from the disciples, and they were polluting their minds, poisoning their minds against the brethren. They were preventing the gospel from going out and leavening society. Because remember, we had this great apostasy happen in the first century. That's a failure. I don't care. Anybody tells me that's not a failure, I'm going to tell them that they're full of it. That's a failure. If that's the end of the story, that's a failure, because Christ said in Matthew 13, he said, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman put in a measure or 2 measures of meal until the whole was leavened. Didn't say anything about it being leavened and then the next morning she gets up and it's all flat dough. Didn't say that. Said it's got to be leavened. So in order for the gospel to leaven humanity, this impediment, this opposition, the satanic opposition, had to be taken out of the way. That's what the binding of Satan is, in my humble opinion. That's what the binding of Satan is. And that's just, for starters. There's a lot more. But I just wanted to go through some of the more salient aspects of this idea of presentism. Like I said, it's a placeholder name. It may stick, it may not. But what I'm saying is the parousia is happening now. The great white throne's happening now. The resurrection's happening now. And it's not all in the past, but it's not all in the future either. There's still some things in the future that are going to take place, like the restoration of the Jews and the restoration of Israel are obviously still going to take place. I believe everybody's going to be restored eventually, but it's going to be more towards the close of the Gog and Magog war, which could be taken figuratively. It doesn't have to be taken literally. It could just depict a massive assault on the church. It could depict that. I lean more towards a more literal view of of these forces attacking. Maybe it might be a city, might be a physical city. It's probably talking about just an uprising of wickedness against the true saints, which are going to be a lot of Jewish people are going to be in there, because I think there's, I honestly believe that the revivals that we're seeing happening among Jews are probably more impactful than those that we've seen among Gentiles in recent decades. From what I can see, Those are more impactful. I think they're going to last longer too. So let's see. So he says physical death was not the consequence of sin. Well, I think it was let me put it this way. Physical death was not it was a byproduct only insofar. It was a consequence of being barred from partaking of the tree of life. So that's the problem right there, because if you're not allowed to partake of the tree of life, and look, I understand the story is not, I understand it's a historical story that has a lot of depth to it. I'm not trying to make it, I'm not trying to bring it down to a wooden literal interpretation. But being barred from the tree of life would cause that person to physically die, because they don't have the sustenance needed to keep their bodies alive. So what happens in the garden? You have a moral death take place in the garden. And the moral death, it becomes ingrained in our anthropology. It becomes ingrained in our way of life. We partake of the knowledge of good and evil. Everything we see around us is a mixture of good and evil. We can't get away from it. We choose the good. We create a utopia, and we screw it up. We create a great neighborhood. We brand new houses. We screw it up every single time. We can't get it right. Unless you're in the Hamptons. Now that's a different story. But for most of us, those of us who weren't raised, with a silver spoon in our mouths, we do see suffering, we do see evil, we do see a mixture of good and evil. Sometimes more on the evil side, and of course, sometimes more on the side of good. But Christ again tells us, this is the good, choose this and reject the evil. And those who, of course, do this will enter the garden. So those who attain the first resurrection, they enter the garden right away, and they're allowed to partake of the tree of life. That's what reverses physical death, not the resurrection. All the resurrection does is give you a new resurrection body that's morally conformed to Christ. Now, if you weren't morally conformed to Christ in this world, that you can't get that body. That's why you've got to wait 1,000 years. So I think I talked about that in another podcast a few weeks ago, but that's the mechanics that I'm looking at as far as the first resurrection and the second death, is they have to undergo further discipline in order to conform to Christ, because they didn't do so in this life. So those of us who don't quite meet the benchmark, maybe we're a little worldly, or maybe we have problems with sin, or with anger management or something, and it's sin does leave a stain on your character. That's one of the things the great universalists have most of the good ones have pointed out, is that death doesn't work a moral transformation. It's not as if you just shuffle off the body and all of a sudden now you're pure and spotless and snow white. If you've lived a life of sin, it's going to leave an impress on your character, and you take that character with you when you die. And so if you're not conformed to Christ, then you can't receive that body right away. You have to wait. You have to undergo further discipline. And then ultimately, at the end of the 1,000 years, when the rest of the dead live again, that's when once you're conformed to Christ, that's when you get your resurrection body. That's why there's no wicked dead mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15. It says, in the parousia, they that are Christ's in the parousia, in his presence, which lasts all through the millennium, the dead are raised individually. But it doesn't mention the wicked dead. It says, isn't Christ, is it as in Adam all die, even so in Christ will all be made alive. But for I don't want to have to go there, but you know what it says. Christ the first fruits, then they afterwards they that are Christ's in his parousia, then cometh the end. So after the parousia, that's when the end comes, and there are no more wicked at the end. There are no more wicked dead. They're all restored. That's why it doesn't mention the wicked dead. So, but you have this millennial period during which Christ is judging the living and the dead, and he's giving his saints who have overcome, he's giving them immediate inheritance in heaven once they die. And then those who haven't met that benchmark, they have to go to the second death. But as a word of consolation, Ezekiel 37 speaks of resurrection from Gehenna. I believe sincerely that's what it's talking about. Sure, it's talking about all Israel, but remember, Israel is, you could take Israel as a figure of humanity as well, because you go back to the Adamic and you see that, man in the garden, all this garden topology, very similar to what Israel received in her system of religious worship. So the Adamic, the Israel is saved first, and then, of course, the mankind is saved afterwards. It's a staggered, if you will, or a structured salvation. It's not a wham, bam, whatever. It's a structured salvation. So that's just the way I view it. And that's, something that I'm going to talk about, I think, in a few more videos. But I just wanted to do just a brief rundown tonight. I'm not going to make it too long. And let's see. Tristan Gabriel, greetings, my friend. Greetings. Thanks for showing up. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've been doing this for quite a while. So I've got the books, I've got the knowledge. I'm just trying to put it together just like everyone else. But I wanted to say I'm not a preterist. I don't consider myself a preterist because, number one, I don't believe that everything's in the past. I mean, I believe certain things did begin in AD 70. I certainly believe that the tribulation and all that happened in the first century. The tribulation, all that is saying, well, the tribulation is getting you through the birth pangs so that so that the children can be delivered. Church couldn't bear any children while you had until the birth pangs, until this old Israel gave birth. So, she had to give birth so that the church could produce children. You'll find that in Isaiah, I think 65, and in other texts as well. But I think that's past. I think there's a number of things that are past. Now, is there going to be a similarity between certain things like the Gog and Magog battle and the tribulation? Could be. Could we see another world leader rise up and say, act like the beast? Might be. I don't know. All I know is I have to go strictly by the scriptures, though. Say there doesn't appear to be anybody like that. We're talking about Nero. We're really talking about paganism and Judaism in Revelation chapter 13. But the beast that John was expecting to rise was Nero. And of course, Nero cut him off at the pass in AD 70. Paganism and Judaism got consigned to perdition. And ultimately, when the kingdom of Christ comes, that stone from heaven, it breaks the image on its feet. And then that's when the stone fills the earth. But it's a gradual process. Everything's got to be broken down. So you have Western history, you have Constantine, you have the nations that were gradually brought into Christianity, and then, of course, the rise of Islam and the repelling Islam. But again, a lot of that is also governed by the principles of land entrance. If the covenant people don't behave and obey the covenant, then the enemies take precedence. And that's what we see happening in today's society. So anyways, I don't want to make it too long, but I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Thanks again. I will try to be back next week. Until then, have a great week, a great weekend, great 4th of July, and I'll talk to you soon.